How would you characterize the readiness of corporations, big enterprises to deal with, confront, utilize, capitalize on not just generative AI, but this whole host of opportunities? What's your sense of that capacity to do these things?
So to be perfectly candid, I think generative AI, or the velocity with which it grew, took everyone by surprise. So speaking of readiness, right? Google's been in the AI space for a number of years, but even they were taken by surprise with what OpenAI came up with, right? I was at a tech company till a few weeks back. We were as well. We had to scramble and run through demos to show our leadership why our chatbots were not able to do what OpenAI was able to do with ChatGPT. So readiness was an issue for a lot of, especially large organizations, right? But I think in terms of how to deal with it, attack with it, I think the best way is, and it's been alluded to all through the day, is to transform your organization into being an agile, a nimble organization, understanding what you can build and own from a technology standpoint, and where you cannot own it, figuring out what the right partners are in this space. But definitely, to Richie's point earlier on too, this is a very significant transformational point in time, and it'll be important to not miss the beat with this one.
If you don't already have a couple of pilots underway, I think you're behind. In terms of readiness, this moment reminds me a lot of when RPA came out, if you remember, 5 years ago. So, more than 5 years. Let's say it came out 7 years ago. We were still calling it next-gen technology up until about 5 years ago, right? And now it's just part of the fabric,
yep.
Right? Same thing's going to happen with Gen AI. It's going to become a part of the fabric, right? So, obviously everyone's at various places with respect to readiness. But what I don't want to see, and what I did see with automation, with robotic type automation, was that some organizations were waiting until they had everything sort of ready to go. Their COE was in place, the tools and technologies were there, the rules, the policies, et cetera. We need a little bit of a, democratization, maybe you would call it. Just start doing some stuff, right? There's probably a certain kind of bare minimum MVP that we need with respect to data confidentiality and usability and cyber. But once you get that, let people go, let people do stuff, right? So readiness obviously varies. I think there's some ways we can get started very quickly. And if we're not already doing that, we're probably a little bit behind our competitors.
Well said.
I'd like to break it up into two parts. One is the sponsorship element. I think that is taken care of, right? The top-down sponsorship of saying, hey, listen, this is an area everybody needs to get into, which is a big problem, by the way. How do you actually bubble it up? This is getting driven in some sense top-down. I think that part is taken care of, right? At the execution layer, I'm going to break that into kind of three different elements of execution. Technology, I think people will sort it out. Right? Most likely, it may not necessarily be the large language models. Maybe it'll be narrow, deep, that is relevant within the organization. People will figure it out. The second part, which for me, I think where the organizations themselves are not ready for it, I think across, is how do you look at compliance, the trust, to what you mentioned? How do you look at the purpose, the soft elements of how do you go about implementing something like this? I think there is still a lot of work to be done in that space, and that is for the industry in some sense to bring it forward and say, hey, listen, what is the guardrails that you're actually building, and how do you actually build that together? Right? I think that trust piece is still out there. Mm-hmm. The third piece, I think there's a very exciting area, is how do you look at use cases? Now, it's one thing to say that, hey, listen, this will completely change all your processes. But I think the big opportunity area for providers and for the businesses themselves is to figure out which are those fantastic opportunity areas beyond just your CX. Or, how do you bring it into finance? Or how do you really bring it into banking? And remember, you need a 0-1 answer. You need 100% accuracy. So how do you get generative AI to come up and say, hey, listen, this is how I can apply it, right? So I think that's the dimension that I would really
Excellent. Well said.
If we look at each function, there's probably a dozen use cases already out there in each function, right? Employee onboarding is probably something which is going to be huge because it's a big problem, not a problem, it's a big effort, and it probably doesn't need to be. From there, think about customer onboarding, same type of thing, right? Anything that requires a ton of data, right? Third-party risk management. Where's our compliance people? I'm one of them. Third-party risk management, right, can be transformed like this. Obviously, the code, chatbot's something that's already kind of been there, but now we're ready to take that to the next level. So there's, as you go function by function, process by process through kind of everything that a business does, it's not hard to start thinking about what requires a ton of data, what requires a ton of human energy, and those things are sort of natural candidates. One further point with the service provider community, right? All of these service providers are, of course, talking about their skills with AI, with Gen AI, et cetera. And they're always talking about how they help their customers do these things that we're talking about, either, their customer-facing processes or their, functional processes or whatever. What I'm hearing a lot less about, which maybe is the next phase to get my train of thought back, how are service providers going to reinvent their own processes as they deliver core services to their clients? And I'm thinking about things like managing a data center, running a compute infrastructure, running storage, right? Some of that stuff, I'm hearing a lot less about that. That's going to be an interesting next phase, in my opinion.
Right now, what you see is like a reason upon, right? Very calm outside, but a lot of renting work happening actually behind the scenes, because it's also an opportunity for service providers themselves to do, quote unquote, eat their own dog food, because there's a lot of efficiencies that can get driven, right? Take a look at fixed price contracts. I mean, we've seen that, right? How do you really drive efficiencies internally within service providers that can add a significant amount to the bottom line, right? It also helps fine-tune a large reskilling program, because it's not that the talent everybody knows about it, right? Now, working on these programs also help with huge reskilling at the background that's happening today to make sure that you're ready for delivering to the customers when it goes beyond the pilot phase. Pilot phase is fine. You're looking at small numbers. You're looking at here and there. Yeah, I mean, this is what it is. But once you need to set the methodologies. I mean, for Infosys per se, if you look at the launch of the Topaz, was essentially that. How do you bring in the methodologies and what's going on internally, make sure that that gets ready before you even hit the market? Right? I think that's really what's going on out there.
The expectations from a customer standpoint are going to increase tenfold, 20-fold, right? Because there will be certain leaders, certain laggards in the space. So you don't have to be the first one to provide the best experience, but as long as you can be a quick follower and be agile enough to get there, at least from a customer experience space, right? I think that's the one that I'm deeply entrenched in. That's going to be the key. And again, to answer your question, whether it's consultants or whether it's technology partners, it will be important for organizations to be self-aware enough to know what they can tackle on their own and what they cannot, and then be quick enough and smart enough to know where to seek for help.
What you're also seeing is you don't necessarily start right at the top, right? You need to be basically digital first, right? You need to have the computing power and cloud enabled, and then you're kind of loading all the AI fees on top. Right? So it depends on what consulting is getting asked to do. Right? And if it's the entire stack, it's a completely different ballgame. Right? Because you're starting with digitization, you're moving them to cloud, and then leveraging what you can do from an AI standpoint. So I think, that depends on, to your point, on what the nature of opportunity.
So how about the whole risk conversation? Somebody pointed out earlier, very interesting, if you're kind of dabbling with generative AI or chat GPT and you're kind of not even consciously realizing you might be putting data from your own organization into this program, that could introduce some very interesting possibilities and vulnerabilities. Is that being thought through at this point?
It absolutely is. If organizations are not thinking about it, they should and must. I think to the point that I was making earlier, right, when we were being pushed by our leadership to explain why we weren't doing from a customer experience standpoint, things that ChatGPT was doing. The biggest factor was around, us not being compliant. What you want from a customer-facing interaction is a lot different than what ChatGPT can provide to anyone and everyone, right? So essentially, to the point that was made earlier too, I think it's right now we're at the phase where a lot of the guardrails are still being built. We still have to figure out, what's kosher. Because the way, to get a little bit technical here, the way generative AI works is that by the definition of generative, it generates on its own, it thinks on its own, and that's based off of a lot of data that's been fed into it, right? So you want to be able to feed your own data as an organization into it, run a lot of tests and iterations on what's playing out before you can let it represent an interaction that doesn't tarnish your brand.
I work for a public accountancy, so we sort of live and die by these topics and compliance and privacy and appropriate use of data and things like that. To put any type of confidential data into a public platform is unthinkable, and clearly policy and controls should be in place to prevent that. Beyond that, to your point about the kind of the top down and the guardrails and the frameworks, like we think about the dimensions of ethical AI, right? And cyber was one dimension, data privacy is one dimension. There's one more dimension among the bunch that I want to bring up, which is representation, right? Because there's a concern about bias in outcomes, right? And so as we have these top-down opportunities to create the guardrails and to put the protections in place, my encouragement would be to have a representative group of individuals participating in that process so that we can prevent and ultimately avoid the bias, which is certainly perceived and perhaps real.
What would constitute that sort of grouping? How do you see that?
Different backgrounds, ethnicities, capabilities. If you think about all of the considerations of, most organizations have some kind of DE&I, I don't know, call it program, call it objective, goal, vision, whatever it is. All of those same types of viewpoints, as well as people from different business units, people from different countries, geographies, et cetera, because the bias can come in many forms.
Interesting.
I was very intrigued by a role that I saw at one of my customers. She introduced herself as a CPO, and she didn't speak a word of procurement, right? She turned around and tells me that it's a chief purpose officer. Right? It is such an amazing one because it is truly multifunctional, multidimensional thinking that is coming together under the whole CPO function, which is a chief purpose officer function, right? And to your point, I think it cannot be owned by technology. It just cannot be owned by an individual's business, because I think we'll miss the point, right? And it is the elephant in the room. That's one of the largest opportunities that we have here. To some extent, it will get sorted out by bringing in, in some sense, going back to the narrow language within the constructs of the environment, your own organization. But still, that doesn't take away the broader ethical aspects and how you actually do. What technology and digital did till now and what it's going to do going forward, I think there's going to be one slight change. When we spoke about RPA, a lot of it impacted the transactional services, right? It hit in some sense at the bottom of the pyramid, right? I mean, it created diamonds in terms of shape. Pyramid became diamonds and everything else. But I think as we look at AI, it's not just hitting there, right? You are looking at the mid-bulge in some sense, right? You are looking at decision-making judgments at some level, right? While on the starting point, those judgments may be just inputting into somebody else who probably takes a final call. But remember, it is hitting at that edge. So what that means for talent is at that level to be able to understand, appreciate what it can do for you, right? And that's a huge shift in thinking for most organizations, right? The second part is, how do you truly create, and Amit spoke about this whole democratization bit. Now, on the ground, that means very different things, because suddenly you have not just core silos of skills, but these are truly pie skills in some sense. It is not just about tea. It's not that you know everything in depth in one, but you truly need to have two legs to stand on, where you have the next skill, which necessarily will be in some sense digital beyond just the functional part. So you're reskilling that middle, you having to reskill and think about what is the additional skill that you need to take account. And to this point of speed, the change is happening so fast today, right? And it's amazing. You asked me the question on the RFP and what's actually coming in. If I take a 5-year view, I need to be able to factor in that the change is going to come much faster than what it came before. And hence be able to bake in what is the nature of talent looking 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, and what will that structure would look like.
Right.
And that's what's...
My clients are revisiting what they consider to be core and non-core, right? Because of the technological changes. They're also rethinking what it means to be onshore, offshore, nearshore, because we've proven that different types of service delivery models can work. That's been proven over the past couple of years. And so as a result, we see this movement, what I call every to every, right? In to out, on to off to on to in, buy a captive, sell a captive, build a captive bot model, right? And bot model, I don't know if you're seeing this, it's getting a lot of attention now because I think a lot of, at least my clients, they've redefined what's core. So they want these skills to be in-house, skills like data engineers and prompt engineers, data analysts, right? AI engineers and the like. They want these skills in-house. They realize it's going to be a competitive advantage for them in the future, but they can't access the people, right? I mean, take an example of a enormous American company, like a grocery chain, right? Household name here, but once you go into another country, they might be completely unheard of. They're not going to get the best talent, right? So they can partner with a third party, access the talent with a plan or a flight path to ultimately bring that back in-house, to transfer that talent back. So I'm seeing a lot of bot models starting to re-emerge as of interest. I don't know if you're seeing that.
Interesting you mentioned bot models, because what I think businesses are also doing is buying time until they figure out things within their head as to how things are actually moving. So you're technically buying options in some sense.
It's an option.
Right? You're buying an option and saying, hey, listen, I know things are going to change. I know things are going to change dramatically. I don't know what it's going to look like. So let me have that option.
Right.
So I think that's probably the reason why.
If I could just follow up on that. So this is like the second wave, at least in my career, which has been maybe 20 years long. 15 years ago, there was a wave of bot where it was about market access. It was about, how do I get to India because I'm not there right now and I don't know how to get there, and like, how do you buy a building in India? I don't know. So help me out, right? And that was bot wave one. It was about market access.
Build, operate, transfer. If anybody doesn't know what that
that's like, sorry for that. I should have.
Yeah,
I shouldn't. Okay. So build, operate, transfer wave 2, which is happening now, is about talent access, capability access, and it's always an option. In bot wave 1, when it was about market access, I saw a lot of bot deals entered into and very few options actually exercised, right? And I suspect, this is again a prediction, I suspect that that's going to happen as well when the service providers demonstrate that they can deliver the services effectively, right? Even if it's sort of core, right? When you can deliver it effectively for your clients, there's no need to transfer it.
Do you concur, Amit? And sort of a tangential question, looking back in your rearview mirror of the corporate environment you've been in, how much angst is there about, are we ready? Do we have the people internally, or do we know what partners to work with to stay up to speed, as everyone's talking about?
So my two previous employers, one was a tech organization, one was not. So in some sense, there is a certain amount of pride that a tech organization has in what they can build and operate on their own. So they were far more reluctant to outsource anything versus, MetLife, where I was prior to Uber, which was a lot more likely to outsource and a lot more open to that idea. But I'll point out one other thing, related to talent. But I think going back to the point of the chief purpose officer, right? I think things are changing so rapidly that it's so important to have, whether that person is the chief purpose officer or chief visionary, but have leadership that's defining what the business objectives are, what the right use cases are to prioritize and go after. So I think because that'll decide what kind of talent you're pulling in, how are you upskilling your talent, all of that. So I think that kind of leadership across organizations is super critical.
I don't think in Europe people have the same view of competition with China as that you see in the US political environment, right? In terms of innovation, and having gone to China pretty often, in terms of innovation, these are completely parallel tracks that you're seeing. Every innovative organization that you see here has a parallel coming out there, right? And they're genuinely doing some fantastic work out there. So I think it's at some point when the two meets again, I think that innovation will come together. But today, I think it's just becoming a competitive innovation nature. I guess it's akin to man's trip to the moon, right? Where competition fostered that innovation. I think that's what is happening today. And the thing is, the market is large even for organizations in China. And some of the stuff that's coming out is absolutely brilliant, right? So you will see Europe adopting it. I don't think they're going to say that yes or no. Obviously, I'm not going to get into the political side of it, of how that will actually play out. To be fair, it's kind of an unfair comparison, right? Just the scale part, right? We'll come to the pricing because it's a function of demand and supply. I think from a scale of what's actually available, I think that is what is kind of making that difference. I think there are huge positives of what you can do from Nearshore. I think that focus needs to be slightly different in terms of what we can.
It's nowhere near the scale, is what he's not saying, but India is massively more scalable.
There are a lot of things that now can sort of be done from anywhere, from remotely, from any country, from any time zone, for that matter, right? Haircut's still going to be here, yeah. But then there's also, but it does matter because even if you decide that something can be done remote, nearshore, offshore, it still matters where, right? Because it's not. I mean, the list was so interesting, right? Yeah. What we saw, Cesar, thank you in the last presentation. It was so interesting. But the reason why it's such a hard problem is because when you plot cost against all of the qualitative conditions, you sort of get a straight line, right? And it's how are you weighting those different factors, right? Am I going to weight the universities that I'm intending to partner with, and I'm going to do a scholarship program there to generate my name recognition to be able to hire people? Like there's a lot of factors that go into it that makes it a really challenging thing. So it's not just can it be remote and does it matter? Wherever it is always matters a lot. And then there's questions like, are you going to set up your own sort of offshore GIC, captive center, whatever you call it? Well, that requires scale, and that requires someone to run the cafeteria, right? Or to run the van that brings people to and from work. And so there's a lot of complications to it beyond just on or off. So in short, yes, I think it all matters.
And bringing it back to technology and AI, there's so much conversation on AI and on tech. There's so much noise, right? So filtering out all of that noise to make sure we talked about trust in the data. That's one aspect of it, but it's also making sure that all of your technology priorities are tied into your business objectives, and then pulling that forward and going to the point that we just made, and based off of that tie-in to business objectives, identifying what you want, what's core, what you want to do in a captive way, what you want to partner with a partner offshore, onshore, or nearshore, right? I think having that strategic leadership and decisioning is going to be critical. I think that's something that we should all be thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Well done.
Okay.